Hello, this is Jim Moore. I'm the president and founder of the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society, and I am delighted for us today to have Chris Inglis, who has just been very much involved in one of the most extraordinary commissions, I think, in our day, dealing with the issue of cybersecurity. And today we're going to try to focus on the commission's report as well as the recommendations that have been made, many of which have already been enacted into law by the Congress, signed by the president in the form of the Defense Act of 2021. Chris, at this moment, is a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to spend this time with him today. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for the warm welcome, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss what I think continues to be a vitally important topic.
You know, it is, in some ways, it's very sad, but at the same time, it's not inexplicable that most Americans have no idea what cybersecurity is all about. And yet, at this critical juncture, at a time when even the administration, the past administration, did not seem to give too much credence to the severity of the problems associated with cybersecurity, this commission was able to really do some extraordinary work, making it the most comprehensive, far-reaching, visionary approach to dealing with a very complex issue like cybersecurity. I would love to hear some of your thoughts generally about what was concluded in this commission, which seems, at least from the outside, to have been a wonderful bipartisan, cooperative group of individuals in trying to come to grips with cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that cyber, for most people, kind of conjures up the mind's image of this tumble of wires, kind of devices, satellites. Most people don't know what to make of the word cyber. They don't know what the noun is. They certainly don't know what the verb is, and they're not entirely certain why they would care about either of those. In that regard, I think that job one is to try to make it such that people do understand what's at stake. What are we actually trying to defend? And so right up front, I think the Solarium Commission tried to understand not what was cyber the noun, what are the tangible pieces of this system that might be the internet plus, but why do we care about that? What are the functions that society depends upon that are fundamentally dependent upon that digital infrastructure? And in so doing, we concluded that those functions, whether those are life critical functions, those that show up in the critical sectors, whether they're functions you care about as a person, your personal banking or your personal affairs, whether they're functions that the government relies upon critically to coordinate its activities around the world, they're all at risk, and not theoretical risk, but actual risk. When you look over your shoulder for the last dozen years or so, you see one pratfall after another where we've suffered some harm. The problem has been that it hasn't been recognized by all people at the same time in the way that perhaps Pearl Harbor was or 9/11 was. So it's not a shared collective event. What Solarium Commission determined was that proceeding forward, the nation is at risk if it doesn't figure out how to create greater resilience and robustness to make it such that we have confidence in the functions dependent upon digital infrastructure, that if adversaries aren't given the message that they shall not hold that at risk, if they can still pick us off one at a time, things will get worse to the point where we'll have a tipping point, where there'll be something of great consequence that is the collective moment of a 9/11. So I would say that in the end, what the Solarium Commission determined was we do have much of the resources, whether that's the technology, whether that's the intellectual power, whether that's the various parties who could be willing to make a difference. What we haven't done is to unify them with a single strategy that is the fabric into which those threads should be woven. And we've not made it such that adversaries have to beat all of us to beat one of us. If there's a jump the shark moment, it's that this strategy would represent how do we take all the good ideas that have been around for quite some time? How do we take all the capabilities? How do we take all the authorities and unify them? Maybe not in a structural way, but in a unity of purpose, unity of effort way. I think that's what the commission is trying to achieve. And thus far, touch wood, of the 80 recommendations we put on the table in 2020, 25 of those have already been enacted in legislation, and some number of those don't require legislation.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. Chris, you've had such a distinguished background. And tell me, when you were the deputy director of the National Security Agency, Were you able to see this train coming? I mean, were the signs there that we better do something?
Well, the Marines had this quote that runs something like, "When the enemy's in range, so are you." And so I think that we've always been clearly aware that we had these enormous capacities to use cyberspace, not simply for the things that most citizens would care about, things I just briefly described a moment ago, but to essentially impose consequences on adversaries, United States Cyber Command, or to perhaps tease intelligence out of that domain. But it turns out that there's no nation on the planet that is at greater risk of those capabilities than the United States. And our allies, I think, kind of follow in as a close second. And so I don't know that we realized quickly enough that this works both ways, that we live in a glass house, and that we need to perhaps give a much greater premium to the defense of this space, as much or more as perhaps our ability to impose consequences on others in this space. And in that regard, we need to reverse the bias. I think any good defense needs an offense. We need to be able to impose consequences on those who would still come at us. But in the absence of a very strong predicate defense, offense makes no difference whatsoever. It actually only exacerbates the problem. So I would say, looking back over my shoulder over the last 35, 40 years, we have always said that we're serious about defense. But it turns out that it's easier to constitute a good offense than a good defense, because offense, you need to be right once. Defense, you need to get it right all the time, 24 hours a day.
You bet. You bet. Chris, this past month, for those of us who were able to watch you did such a super job on 60 Minutes in talking about solar winds, which was certainly in every newspaper, not only here in the United States, but overseas as well. Would you describe a little bit about what solar winds was all about?
Yeah, SolarWinds is one of those events that to most people who don't run that software, or perhaps don't even have an environment where you would need to run monitoring software, it's somewhat abstract, it's somewhat distant. So I'll do it by using this device. I think everyone on this session probably has a smartphone. You can pick your poison as to whether it's an Apple phone or a Galaxy or a Droid-based phone, but you all have one of those. And it actually participates in what we would call a supply chain, which is the apps that run on it, and the foundational software underneath of that comes from somewhere else and is updated on a fairly regular basis. You have trust and confidence that when you kind of open this phone to the next app or to the software that's running underneath that, the operating system, that someone has vouchsafed for its integrity, for the capabilities, that they'll run safely, meaning they'll do the things you want them to do and not the things that you don't want them to do. If someone, let's imagine a nation state, were to hold that at risk, if they were to get into Apple or Google or others who make that software, the various app manufacturers, and modify that in a way that it simply flowed into your phone because that's your expectation of how this works. Your supply chain on the receiving side says, I want that to come into my phone. You'd be at great risk. Now, the assets you have might not be consequential on the national security stage, but that's a supply chain attack. Now take this and kind of look at what SolarWinds was, which was software that any number of companies, 300,000, I think, customers in the world, run SolarWinds software to essentially monitor their local establishments. And the Russians, I believe, essentially saw that as this golden opportunity. If we can get into the SolarWinds software, we can then flow as the updates occur into the various places where that software is used to monitor the local establishments, the configurations, the security profiles, things of that sort. That's a great good. But if we can roll into that and essentially then execute software of our design, the Russian design, we can then hold that at risk. That's a supply chain attack. It essentially could have held at risk 300,000 customers. Now, we might observe that whoever did this, presumably the Russians, they only held at risk perhaps a couple hundred. The 18,000 who downloaded the corrupted software, then translated into the Russians, then took advantage of a further 250, I think is the figure that I've most recently heard. So we might say, well, thank our lucky stars, we got out of that one kind of with only a small amount of perhaps harm. But the problem in that is that if that supply chain is at risk, you rely upon the restraint of the aggressor, the restraint of the Russians, right, to hold yourself safe. The other 18,000 are safe not because they're well defended, but because the Russians weren't interested in them. That supply chain attack is something that is fundamental to the nature of how the internet works, from my phone to those monitoring softwares that show up in those 300,000 companies. And we have a problem, which is we don't really know who it is that's accountable for the entirety of that. Right? There's a role to be played by the consumer who accepts that software. Have you kind of exercised some perhaps critical thinking to think your way through, do I really want to accept that? What confidence do I have in that? Am I actually able to detect an anomaly in that? Most users would say not so much. And if you don't then have an individual responsibility at the consumer level and a producer responsibility at the production level, and everyone else in between collaborating on the defense of that supply chain, those fissures and seams and shadows will create this excellent opportunity for an aggressor like the Russians to step in and say, I'm going to pick this off because of the weakness in the collection of those responsibilities. So the long story made short, SolarWinds is just a microcosm of a larger weakness that really relates not so much to the technology, but to the collaboration of the various parties who participate in the use of that technology to update systems of interest, from my phone to kind of major software.
Yes, indeed. Reports indicate that the Russians would have started into this 9 months before it was detected. How in heaven's name could that have taken such a long period of time for us to have discovered that?
Well, if you're assuming that the software is otherwise functional, unless it tells you that it's not, unless you see some observable anomaly, and if you're the aggressor and you're careful enough not to raise your head above the hedgerow, then complacency is the enemy, right? And I think that's the case here.
And when we talk about the Russians, are we talking about? I think some people in their minds think of Vladimir Putin sitting there and handling it all at the same time. Or are we talking about individual actors who are working out on their own? Is this a coordinated effort?
Yeah, so I'll be careful to say I've not seen the classified assessments that would say that we've got proof positive that it's the Russian government. But most of what I have seen in the public domain would make it clear that this is very likely an activity undertaken by the Russian government in the form of one of its intelligence services. Saw this as an excellent opportunity to get intelligence on some interesting kind of customers of the SolarWinds software.
Yes,
so I don't think Vladimir Putin spends much time on his keyboards, but somewhere downstream of him in the Russian government are people who do, and this is authorized and executed as a Russian government operation.
Yes, indeed. Clearly, this is coming down to a genuine concern about the future defense and security of the United States and its allies. When you think about what we're all going through these days, namely the coronavirus, you can only imagine how cybersecurity has played an important part. There are those who have been trying to figure out how the various companies have been developing their vaccines. There have been some real concerns about how hospitals are able to operate properly when some cyber attacks have occurred there. So we have cybersecurity attacks in simply trying to figure out how to rob the bank, so to speak. So there's so many of these roads that are leading to genuine concern into the future. And, we're so interested as I think as a people at what's happening with the defenses of the United States, but we're so engaged in the latest planes, the latest forces, et cetera. Very much a kind of phase 201 of World War II. And yet it's clear that the real concerns and sensitivities should be directed towards cybersecurity today more than ever, and that we need to be able to readjust our thinking in that way.
I agree. So it's just to think of the role that cyberspace, kind of think of that as the internet plus, plays in the kind of pandemic. First, if we're to make a meaningful response, the coordination, whether that's the medical coordination of how do we share information so that we can rapidly develop a vaccine, how do we coordinate the techniques necessary to provide the therapeutics, most of that takes place on digital infrastructure, one institution dealing with another half a world away. If we ultimately come up with the therapeutics or the vaccines, we have to then coordinate the physical dissemination of those. That relies upon the digital infrastructure to do that exquisite coordination that is the envy, right, of humanity, right, the just-in-time logistics system. But ultimately, the confidence we have in either of those comes from the confidence we have that nobody is going to mess with that. Nobody's going to interdict that in a way that we have the wrong information that we built our vaccine on, or that we don't have the confidence that those vaccines will show up when and where they should. And if you want to attack a society, you can go after it directly, kind of by attacking those first two mechanisms, coordination of response or kind of dissemination of that response, or you can attack it the third way, which is to simply kind of put some lack of confidence into the system by saying, I am in your system, and at my will and at my discretion, I will squeeze that system, squeeze the neck of that system to stop it dead in its tracks. Think about the chilling effect it has on the confidence of a society that is fundamentally dependent upon digital infrastructure. I would also say that the pandemic, while there are some directly observable cyber implications to it, is a metaphor or an analogy for cyber writ large, right? It's one of those things, pandemic, where if we had prepared in advance for that, such that our sensors were deployed and we could see it coming, if we had prepared in advance for that such that we knew who it was that would try to then organize, right, the reduction of the spread of that disease, or who it was that would quickly start the development of the vaccine. If we had an international consortia that would kind of put all of the best minds on this, if we'd done that in advance, we would have been months ahead and perhaps in a fundamentally different place today. If we'd had installed the relationships before that event, we would have been able to coordinate that from federal to state and local in ways today that we're still struggling with. And ultimately, that pandemic is actually more kind to us than a cyber event would be, because the pandemic is modifying its threat to us at Darwinian speed. Right, as we see the variants emerge 6-9 months after this first happened, not surprising that that happens. That shows that Darwin is at play. In a cyber event, I think as you'd earlier observed, right, you have a human adversary on the other side that can watch what you do and change instantaneously. That can change on a dime. And therefore, if you're not prepared in advance, if your relationships, if your apparatus, if your processes aren't prepared in advance of that event, they will continue to seize the initiative. They will continue to drive the operations in a way that advantages the adversary as opposed to the defender. And so there's some very strong analogies that we should pick up on, lift and shift into the cyber world so that we prepare and that we operate accordingly.
Chris, given what you just said, it certainly occurs to me and others that the expense on the part of those who want to defend themselves against cyber attacks is going to be and continue to be enormous. And yet those who are perpetrating, those bad actors who want to penetrate the shields that we continue to try to put up, don't have to put in that kind of an investment to do untoward things. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, there's a great asymmetry here, which is in order to properly defend yourself, you have to get everything right. In order to kind of be successful in the attack, you can get one thing right. And I think how do you counter that is you kind of make it such that you're bringing all of your resources to bear, many of which you don't own, meaning that you collaborate so that an adversary that's going to pick you off one at a time has to actually beat the team that you're on. They have to beat all of us to beat one of us. And so let's imagine that in the SolarWinds case, that you'd had the producers of that software collaborating in some meaningful way with the disseminators of that software, collaborating in some way with the folks who were running that software, such that if any one of them saw an anomaly, they were all kind of on the front balls of their feet. If anyone saw an anomaly, they would flag it to everybody else, and you would quickly get to the root cause, pretty much like when FireEye kind of identified that late in the game. That then went across like a kind of a prairie fire, and everyone else then could find it. Let's do that now reflexively as a matter of course, such that if you're going to try to beat us, you need to beat all of us. I think that's the strategy that you need to undertake, because it turns out many places along that supply chain, they really don't have the resources to think strongly kind of about kind of cybersecurity. If, however, they could rely upon the unified effort of everyone simply saying that, hey, we will defend this together, we'd be in a much better place. There's a really good analogy to be had here in terms of how we defend the physical territory of our communities, our neighborhoods, our nation. Right here I am sitting in a house in Annapolis, Maryland, and from time to time a policeman goes by helping to perhaps keep order and discipline in this neighborhood. I've locked my doors when I go to sleep at night. I lock my car because I play a role in my own physical security. There's a National Guard not too far away that will respond to natural disasters. And if Pennsylvania attacks Maryland, they might help defend Maryland against that. There are people who are guarding at the airports, kind of the various activities that come and go. There are folks out in kind of Colorado that are defending the skies over America from a 3-stage missile that might come from North Korea. But when you add all of that up, those collaborative activities side by side, from individuals to organizations, private sector, public sector, happen concurrently in a way that's hugely complementary, because we've tried to figure out over time how we defend that territory using all of the capabilities at our disposal. Today in cyberspace, turns out it's every person for themselves. Everyone's defending their little patch, right? And there are a lot of mom and pop activities out there that no one is defending their patch, right? They're essentially on their own. Cyber is unique in most of the domains I'm familiar with, which is that the risk is borne almost entirely by the consumer or the actual operator, as opposed to by the provider or by some consortium that lives around them. We need to change that calculus and use the experience we have in places like the physical domain to that end.
Implicit to what you just said, Chris, it is clear that business, government have got to work more closely together on behalf of society. I think the approach to the coronavirus, certainly most recently, has been extraordinary, in which the government has really been so heavily involved in trying to make sure that the private sector, in this case pharmaceutical companies, are being able to meet the demand of the coronavirus. And it's even incredible to realize that as the vaccines have been rolling out, that 2 companies that have been fairly vicious competitors with one another, namely Johnson & Johnson and Merck, have come together, in which Merck is going to be helping to produce some of the vaccines that Johnson & Johnson has developed, to be able to make sure that by the end of May, according to President Biden, we're going to see that all adults have, in effect, been able to get the vaccine. How would you address this issue of how critical it is in the area of cyberspace, cybersecurity, to have the government and the private sector working together? And how do you view the way they have been working up to now?
It's essential. I think the example that you just described shows that the government can fill a very critical role, to be a promoter, to say this is an issue of common concern, and to be a convener, to say, I'll give the authority, or perhaps the compelling authority, that we need to actually work this together collaboratively, and a contributor, right? Resources were required to advance, right, those vaccines, right, well before they became reality. The federal government did, I think, a good job in essentially injecting, right, those 3 capabilities into that effort. Now lift and shift that to cyber. The government, the federal government in particular, working with international, right, like-minded nations, can and should promote this as an issue of societal consequence, an issue of common concern. It should then convene, right, private-public collaborations such that we can perhaps use those collective efforts in a way that the sum of the parts will exceed the sum of the parts. Right? Division of effort is going to be a siren on the rocks in this moment. We'll be picked off one at a time if each party tries to defend their patch alone, as if those patches were somehow disconnected from one another. And the government can make a meaningful contribution, not simply stand by and watch the private sector struggle against adversaries like rogue nation states who are holding them at risk, or in some cases struggle with a lack of understanding about what's happening in the wider, larger world that you cannot expect that a private organization would know. If in fact the SolarWinds was attributable to the Russian kind of intelligence services, there's probably an organization, right, in the United States government that can see that coming. And the question is whether that information should be used simply to defend US government prerogatives or US government networks, or whether that must be brought to bear to defend the larger enterprise that shares that threat. I think the answer must be the latter. And the federal government, not alone, like in concert with other governments, needs to turn itself to where it actually is a co-conspirator, a co-collaborator in the defense of the infrastructure that is well wide of what the government itself owns and operates.
Mhm. In the past few days, the General Accounting Office has come out with a report that it excoriated, quite frankly, a number of agencies within the federal government that it believes have been wanting in terms of taking care of cybersecurity for their own departments. And of course, to have the commission do the kind of work that it did, and to be able to see, I mean, it is really remarkable that you have had 25, 26 recommendations enacted into law and in a relatively short period of time. I've never seen anything quite like that for any commission that I've known of in the U.S. government. But from certainly my standpoint and the standpoint of others, the notion of returning to the White House a director, someone who is overseeing the cybersecurity needs of the United States, is something that is terribly critical. Would you speak to that? I must admit that when I think of the poor person that's going to have to take over that role, I don't envy him or her in having to take on the problems that have essentially accrued when it comes to the organization of cybersecurity and dealing with that in the U.S. government, but also taking on the new demands and challenges. How do you envision what the director has before him or her, and what needs to be done?
Yeah, so first to your observation of what the General Accounting Office said, it's not terribly surprising, as disappointing as it might be, not terribly surprising, because you have great variance in the amount of resources that are available to these federal agencies and departments. Think of the Department of Defense, the size of it compared to most of the others. It's a sun dwarfing, right, all of the stars in the sky. And there's a very great variance in the expertise that these departments have. And that might come from some degree of inertia. There was a moment in time when your defense was entirely based upon how you defended your paper files, but now we're all massively digitally connected. We're all at common risk. And yet the cyber expertise, the digital expertise hasn't caught up with that. The answer isn't to essentially hold each and every one of them independently accountable to try to figure out what cybersecurity looks like and how to develop the resources necessary to defend their small stovepipe of the digital infrastructure they have. The answer is, how do we bring to bear all of the resources at our disposal such that we have not just a common challenge, but we have a unified effort to essentially address that challenge. And in that regard, the Solarian Commission has recommended 3 broad elements of the strategy. It's kind of sometimes labeled under the rubric of a cyber deterrence strategy, but leaving that word aside for the moment, I think it stands in as a good cyber strategy, which is, 1, we need to reshape expectations and behaviors. We need to recast who is accountable for what. Individuals, individual agencies, individual departments kind of have some responsibility, but not complete and total, because we can't expect that they all have equal capacity to make a difference. 2, we need to harden. We need to make more resilient the software, the hardware, and the people, which are often the weakest link in this. We need to meaningfully increase the resilience and robustness such that it's simply harder for an adversary to take advantage of us, be they a criminal or a nation state. And 3, we need to begin to change the mindset of adversaries by imposing consequences on them, aligning actions and consequences, imposing consequences on them if they still come at us. Turns out that most mom and pop agencies or shops, they can't do that third piece, but it properly supports the first 2 pieces. And so we need to figure out what's the strategy for all of us. How do we then kind of insert that strategy such that we're using all of those capabilities, all the various instruments in that orchestra? And how do we then create those unity of purpose efforts necessary to pull that off? In the absence of someone or some process that's accountable for that, it doesn't self-organize. It doesn't self-organize at all, let alone nicely from the foundations up. Because what the GAO is observing is the result of a self-organizing cyber strategy. You get these greatly uneven, greatly disappointing results kind of from left to right across the landscape. So the Cyber Space Solarium Commission has recommended that there be a national cyber director who is accountable for that strategy, for the fabric, who will connect those disparate pieces such that we have unity of effort, so that everyone can take advantage of all the other capabilities as much or more as their own kind of siloed capabilities. That might not be kind of the entirety of a strategy you should bet on, but it's a great start, right? Trying to create unity of effort, unity of purpose, and make it such that you're now participating in a larger effort where you can depend to the left or the right that you're in a supportive ecosystem. You're not left to swing in the wind on your own. The problem now is that if the Russians or the Chinese or some criminal element wants to pick us off one at a time, they can, they do. And there's very little notice taken by someone who's standing in their silo looking at their feet. We need to get our head up. We need to get our arms out. We need to lock arms in that such that we actually have a unified effort.
To that point, we've really been very much preoccupied with what we're doing right here in the United States. But do you see this new director involved in trying to work with the State Department and the Defense Department in coordinating the efforts of our allies so that we're not simply in this boat alone?
Yes, by law, the law that created the cyber director position, that is actually an explicit part of their remit, right? That they are supposed to work, again, through the normal channels, right? So use our State Department and the other offices that have been created to deal with our foreign partners, but to have an international engagement such that this national strategy can live in the strongest possible larger context of an international strategy, that like-minded nations operating in concert with one another, operating according to some perhaps commonly understood and practiced norms, might in fact prevail over rogue actors who now have to take on the coalition. So that's a very important part of it.
Very good. I'm wondering, we're getting quite a few questions that are coming in, not only from places across the United States, but around the world as well. Warren Smith wants to know, and I think it's an excellent question, and that is whether the government, given the impact of the private sector on society generally, and we saw certainly what happened with SolarWinds with various government entities. Should there be some kind of a system put into place by the government that rates various relevant companies in how prepared they are to be able to fend off cyber attacks?
I think so. We're going to have to be careful, though, about having a one-size-fits-all proposition. So look at what the Defense Department has done, right, in terms of requiring that their vendors, the people who supply capability to the Defense Department, to meet, various levels, level 1 through, I think, level 5 at the moment are the possibilities. And so if you're going to provide capability to the Defense Department, you have to sign up and say, I'm willing to let you look at my supply chain in terms of how I develop capability, how I I secure that capability, I kind of produce and disseminate that capability with a very strong look at the cyber components of that reliance that we have on digital infrastructure. And that's because the Defense Department has determined that those capabilities constitute a critical foundation for the defense of the nation, right? We might have a similar view about how we then produce electrical grids, right? They're comprised of tens of thousands of smaller parts. We might have a similar view about how we treat the transportation system and so on and so forth. So we're going to need to be careful about making sure that we identify what's more important than not, and then apply standards to that in a way that we then kind of can prioritize our efforts to make more resilient, more robust, and then to attendantly kind of defend properly those things of greater consequence to us. I would say that at the moment, the United States has identified 16 critical infrastructures. They're probably not surprising to kind of most people who haven't looked at that closely: the energy sector, the financial sector, the logistics sector, and so on and so forth. And having said that they're critical, we've only done half the job, because inside of those, not all things are equally critical, right? It may well be that a kind of credit union serving kind of 15 people kind of in some out of the way place, important, right, to them to be sure, is not as vital as the flow of monies that occur in New York City on a daily basis that constitutes the very foundations of our economy. And so we're going to have to pull the threads horizontally across those sectors to say one thing perhaps might be more important than another based upon the impact, the consequence of that function to society. In that regard, the Solarium Commission has nominated a few, not least of which is the continuity of the economy. It's recommended that we, on probably a biannual basis, run an exercise to kind of work through do we believe that the digital infrastructure underpinning the daily activities of our economy, financial flows, the electricity necessary to support the digital infrastructure, et cetera, do we believe that that is sufficiently resilient and robust? And are we actually defending it against adversaries who would kind of try to hold it at risk, that we're confident that it's in the right place? And there'll be some surprises from time to time that we perhaps have left something uncovered, something unguarded. If you get that in the exercise moment, you then have the opportunity to make that investment. But pulling that thread horizontally makes us better, not simply ahead of an event, but in an event, because we now have the muscle memory to know how those things are constituted. And we have the relationships from that exercising to essentially rely on one another, left or right, to defend that. I think that's what we need to go going forward. So standards are important, exercising is important, but prioritization is equally important because we can't defend all things against all perils.
During the deliberations of the commission, was there much in the way of discussions as to being able to see what other countries have been doing to be able to secure their cyber defense? And as a second part of that same question, are there any countries that stand out in your mind as having really done an admirable job in being able to protect cybersecurity?
Yeah, there was, and I'll take the risk of kind of calling out two in particular, but we consulted, I think, with upwards of about a dozen different nations just to say, how do you think of this? How do you organize for this? What's the relationship that your government has internally to itself? How have you made that coherent? And what's the relationship between your government and your private sector? And two that stood out as being particularly strong were the United Kingdom and Israel. Now they're kind of smaller concerns and it might be kind of more straightforward to organize, but nonetheless, they've solved some really hard problems. The United Kingdom in particular has this activity that I describe as the exemplar of how private-public collaboration should take place. It's called the National Cyber Security Center. And if you were to go to that facility, it's a physical place, you would find members of the government, kind of solid technical experts, standing alongside members of the private sector, again, solid technical experts, trying to find together threats to the common infrastructure and to mitigate those threats together. That happens at an unclassified level, meaning it's not yet proprietary, it's not yet literally classified, so that they're collaborating at the lowest possible level. There's magic in that, which is that you create relationships at that discovery moment so that you can inform each other about what perhaps is coursing across the common network. And when a crisis arises, you go to a contingency or crisis, those relationships actually lean in towards one another, they get stronger. And as one side maybe takes that information and makes it proprietary because it now has some particular effect inside their stovepipe, or the other side, the government, makes it classified, those relationships having already been established, it's more likely that you'll know what to share and how to share in the heat of the moment. Oftentimes, we find that we've reversed that process. We essentially do that work privately within our stovepipes, trying to figure out a threat inside your own little patch of the digital infrastructure. You then enrich it to make it proprietary or classified. And at some point you say, this is important or noteworthy enough, I need to push it to somebody else. And you have this unholy dilemma of how do you sanitize it such that you can then push it across without disclosing something you didn't want to disclose about your operation. Our British friends have solved that problem. We need to actually kind of embrace that. We've taken some of what they've done, and the Israelis similarly, and tried to incorporate that in our processes. Now we're bigger, we're more complicated. We have many of kind of some things that they only have one of, and so it's perhaps harder for us to get to that unity of effort. But I think that's one of the big lessons. Unity of effort, private-public collaboration is essential, and we've embraced that, and we're moving forward on that.
Chris, in all that you have said today, it sounds to me as though the enemy, in this case, the bad actors in cybersecurity, are becoming exponentially more sophisticated and more brazen in the way they're approaching all this.
Well, I'd give them the second. I'd certainly give them the second. They're becoming considerably more brazen. But I would say in terms of the level of their sophistication, most of the time when we discover what they've done, we might be impressed by the audacity of the effort and perhaps the patience of the effort. Think about SolarWinds. But the sophistication in terms of what they've done and how clever it is, not so much. right?
Huh,
So think of
that's
solar
interesting.
winds as it probably, I'm kind of guessing on this. I'm not sure that we know completely how it got its start, but probably required a human being somewhere in that long chain of events that is the supply chain to make a mistake, to click on
Hmm.
a link and allow kind of someone to get into their system, to get a foothold, and then to move, the kind of term of art is to then move laterally and to acquire greater and greater permission and privilege inside that system. But it all started with a relatively simple error made by probably a human being somewhere, compounded by complacency, all right, which is a great sin in this space, that thinks that imagines that all is well unless the system itself exhibits some strong anomaly. And that perhaps might be the audacity of the adversary saying, I'll be patient, I'll get in, I'll get a small foothold, and I'll be patient, and I'll keep my head below the hedgerows, and I'll wait 9 months in order to effect a greater kind of scam than perhaps taking the tactical advantage that there is up front. I think all of that to say that it's often less about the technology. To be sure, it's born of technology, but it's almost always less about technology than it is about human practice, right? About the human being the weak link in the system. We can't take the human entirely out of the system. That's why these systems exist, to serve the needs of mankind. But we can, in fact, make the human more resilient and more robust. And we can, in fact, connect those humans one to another, get the roles and responsibilities correct, so that I have some confidence that activities I don't control the government, but I need to have confidence that the government's acting in my best interest by applying its powers right out well in front of me in ways that make my patch of this more resilient, more robust, or more likely to be well defended. If I had that confidence in the cyber ecosystem, the way I do sitting in this house in a neighborhood and kind of in the environs of the rural Maryland, if I had that confidence in cyberspace, we'd be a long way ahead on this problem.
Hmm. Chris, you've worn so many hats, and today you were sitting in Annapolis as an educator. And one of the things that we're doing at the Washington Institute is one of our major missions is to really try to focus on tomorrow's leaders, and trying to see that we engage students as well as faculty. And cybersecurity is a relatively modern phenomenon in terms of getting it into the human consciousness. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how we are educating students today in being able to deal with the dilemma of cybersecurity and being prepared for a world that they're going to have to live in which this is going to become an even greater. There will be a greater awareness of what all is engaged with cybersecurity.
Yeah, so let me cover that 3 ways. One, to say that for those people who literally have the word cyber in their job title, we're clearly not creating enough hands-on keyboard operators or information technology specialists. And that problem, there's a lot of focus on that. And we're trying to figure out what are the incentives that will actually encourage more people and a more diverse group of people to take those on. So let me leave that aside for the moment. The second part of the problem is that we assume far too often the people who are raised in the midst of all this technology have then become by virtue of that experience that they've become digital natives, that they understand absolutely how this stuff works and what the consequences are of where they store their material or how they store their material or who they engage with on the internet. Nothing could be further from the truth, because kind of companies like Apple and others have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in making this stuff so intuitive, you don't have to understand what's happening underneath, right? You can simply store your material in the cloud, wherever that is, whatever that is. You can simply use an app using kind of the intuitive features that a human being would appreciate without knowing what that app is actually doing. What data is it stealing away about your location? What data is it storing out there about your behaviors, your proclivities, your preferences that you might not want to be widely known, right? And so when you add all that up, right, we have a problem that everyone in our society doesn't have the foundational kind of insights that they need to essentially figure out what to do with the digital infrastructure that they have at their disposal. So having said that there's an all problem, which is that everyone needs to know something more about the nature of digital infrastructure than they get by simply being in its proximity. Now, I wouldn't give a programming course to every person in the country, But I would have a basic kind of discussion with them about, here's how this stuff really works. Here's what happens when you actually stuff this into the cloud, in much the same way that I will instruct someone the difference between a debit card and a credit card. It's a profound difference. Debit card is cash. And if you write your PIN number on the back of the debit cards and it's lost, all your cash is gone. You'll have no kind of, salvation in that. There's an equivalent to that in cyberspace. Now let's get to what kind of certain institutions have done to combine those two. At the United States Naval Academy, where I teach at the moment, they've considered both of those problems. And so for every midshipman who shows up at the United States Naval Academy, you have to take 2 mandatory courses in cyber. Even if you major in English or political science or some, one of those kind of important but less technical disciplines, you have to take 2 courses in cyber. And it's really about taking what are app natives as they come into the institution and creating digital natives, because every one of them will ultimately go out and live in a world where the operations that they undertake are fundamentally dependent upon digital infrastructure in a way that if they don't understand how that digital infrastructure works, they will be surprised, and sometimes surprised by an adversary that takes advantage of their lack of understanding. So for many at the Naval Academy, that's the all portion. For many at the Naval Academy, they might be studying the law, they might be studying system engineering, they might be studying some primary discipline that doesn't have the word cyber or information technology in it, but it's fundamentally dependent, right? Or perhaps in the reverse, kind of the resilience of our ecosystem is dependent upon what they do, right? And so we have to actually invest into those curricula, more about the digital infrastructure, more about the cyber implications, so that lawyers, so that political scientists, so that system engineers will build and operate systems of interest in a way that satisfies their part of this larger ecosystem. And then for the few who are going to major in cyber is a discipline in its own right, we've created a separate major called the cyber operations major. I think the actual discipline is accredited under something called cyber science. And importantly, we did not make that a subset of cyber or computer science or of any other kind of deep and sharp technical discipline, because we believe that the cyber operations majors need to actually study 3 broad categories of things. One is they need to know enough about the technology to build and operate networks of consequence. So if somebody turned to them and said, how would you build one of those? They'd know. 2, they need to know a lot about the human factors, because the human plays an essential role, right, in using, manipulating, making choices inside of that digital infrastructure. And cyberspace operates differently than physical space in terms of how things are presented to you, the scope and the scale. So there's some human factors courses. And 3, right, they need to know something about the law, the ethics, the principles that govern the American way of these systems, because there are certain things that we simply cannot do because we as a society believe that privacy is equal, right, to collective defense. And we try to achieve both of those. That major tries to figure out how to imbue those students with all 3 of those, such that when they go out, they might not be the people who are literally hands on a keyboard mounting computer attacks or kind of defending against computer attacks, but they can meaningfully compose networks, mount operations on top of those networks, and have every confidence in the world that those will do what we need them to do, and that they will be held safe, if not harmless, right, from those who would kind of take unfair advantage against them. I think that education is a good exemplar of broadly what we should do across the United States. K through 12, digital literacy is very important, right? We need to make sure that the specific kind of trade houses of law schools and engineering schools do more about digital literacy, and that we need to create that cadre that kind of populates those fields where cyber leadership is important. If I could add one thing more, which actually lifts and shifts out of the cyber domain, which is that there is increasingly a threat that cyberspace poses to the confidence of this nation in its own democracy. I would say that it's not endemic to the point where I would say that cyber brought this problem on, but cyber is a means by which autocrats and others can use information to shape the ideas, to shape the views of people who do not know that they're being manipulated. Think of running a troll farm, right, in 2016 to try to convince large blocks of voters that you're just another American sitting beside them in a social website, right, and you have a certain opinion, and multiply that by 50,000, you might be swayed by that. If those 50,000 opinions that purport to come from another American citizen are in fact coming from 5 Russians sitting in a troll house in Moscow, that makes a difference. People need
Mhm.
to know something about the nature, right, of how that works so that they can defend themselves against unwanted influence of that sort. They perhaps need to have greater confidence that this democracy is properly constituted. They need to perhaps have more civics under their belt so that they can apply critical thinking to the disparate forces that still collide in this society, which have always been a feature. The competition of ideas have generally been a feature. We need to turn it back to that purpose so that the internet doesn't perhaps take us to a different place and undermines our confidence. I think that's a really important part of education that I see some really good efforts beginning to get their arms around that. How do we actually do that? Because we're not going to control truth in this society, but we're going to prepare people so that they can independently discriminate between what they hold as being
Sure.
factually important and foundationally vital for their operations in this society.
That's great. Chris, that inspired a question for me. Um, in the work of the commission, did the commission come away believing that we're doing a pretty good job within the U.S. government in looking over the cyber defenses, the cyber mechanisms that are evolving in other countries like China, North Korea, and the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, Russia, to be able to really see how far behind or how far ahead we are?
The commission didn't spend a lot of time trying to actually do a detailed analysis of the state of play in terms of those nation states that will hold us at risk. I think that it had the benefit of some intelligence analyses, but it tried to do most of its work in an open arena so that we could then disclose that to be impactful to a much wider audience. Having said that, we actually know enough to say that we're behind. Right, we're behind those other nation states in our ability to stride for stride have a defense that's the equal of their offense, and that's the true measure. That's the true metric. We might say that our offense is every bit as every bit as good as their offense. That's probably true, or perhaps maybe our offense is better than their offense. That's not the measure of merit. How's our defense stack up against their offense? And I think in that regard, we determined that we're well behind. Right, and that the advantage almost always goes to the attacker because they need to be right once. The defender needs to be right all the time. And we therefore need to shore up the defense. That's the predicate for any ability to hold at risk others using cyber as an instrument of power. And that the offense must be an extension of the defense, not something that's independent of the defense. So I think that's what we were able to determine. I would say that the experience looking over our shoulder over the last 10 years is that we have fallen further and further behind, right? Those nation states that have no qualms about using a free and open society to hold that society at risk. And we need to therefore kind of, while not throwing away or eschewing our kind of adherence to free and open principles, how do we actually shore it up such that, again, they need to beat all of us to beat one of us. And I don't think that we're in the right place at the moment, though we're trending in the right direction.
I wish we had so much more time to talk about so much of an extraordinary, complex, but critical subject. But I would love to know, the commission will continue to exist until the end of this year. And I'm wondering what you're taking away from it. I'd like to try to end on a positive note, recognizing that we have a lot of work, as you were saying, in trying to deal with the defenses in cybersecurity. But how do you walk away? One of the things I will be frank with you, I'm amazed that that this commission was able to work so well together. It had two co-chairs. It does have two co-chairs. One who caucuses with the Democrats, the senator from the state of Maine. The other, a congressman from that was Senator King of Maine, and Congressman Gallagher, Mike Gallagher, who is a Republican. And so the notion that somehow you were able to produce such a substantive, comprehensive, visionary approach, I think is rather extraordinary. But I'm wondering, how you will look back on the work of the commission and what you think the prospects are for being able to follow the recommendations that you worked so hard to achieve.
I would say that in a very positive vein, I think that the prospects are good to excellent, right? I don't want to overstate, that possibility because it must be earned. But I would say that the character of the commission was exactly as you said. It was nonpartisan in every way. It was impossible to determine in the room who was of what political persuasion. The only moment of tension that ever occurred was when Green Bay got into the playoffs in early 2020. And at that point, there were some kind of moments when folks broke eye contact. But otherwise, it was a hugely nonpartisan affair. And any discussion we had about the merits of one alternative or another never went into the corner of, but is that consistent with a party platform or some political platform? It was always what is in the best interest of the nation. I would say a second factor that will argue for or against success, and I think thus far for, is the talent of the staff. We had an enormously talented staff, right? It was large enough to be impactful, but it was diverse and intellectually astute enough to actually know what to work on and how. And so when you look in the back of the long report, look at those names, they've all, for the most part, gone on to kind of greater efforts. But most of the success, I think, would be attributed to the solid staff work that they did. And then I give no small amount of credit, right, to the commission chairs, right, Senator King and Congressman Gallagher for the work that they've done, ably kind of supported by Congressman Langevin and Ben Sass, Senator Sass, who did a lot of the kind of pressing of the flesh and the kind of the office by office work to essentially sell this. And then not least of which, Mark Montgomery, the executive director. If you read the report, it will tell you that we had 300 engagements or so before we actually wrote our report. Since then, we've had about 150 more, right, in the 9 months of the remainder of 2020. And now we're well into 2021. We probably have proportionately about the same number kind of month by month going forward. It's the determination to take that and actually action it that is most important. We had 80 recommendations. 47 of them, I think, more or less, required some legislative action. All of that legislation was written the day we released our report, so that you didn't have to wonder what we meant by it. You could actually pick it up and you could run to daylight. 25 of those then saw their way to legislation that is now in the force of law, a basis or a foundation for us to go forward. And we're equally ambitious about 2021. But we will have jumped the shark. We will have made a difference, not if we implement the recommendations, but if we achieve a degree of unity of effort and collaboration, including private and public resources, including international resources. We will have made the difference if they somehow change the way they behave, the way they think of themselves as part of a common solution, as opposed to independent actors on this stage. I think that's what we all hope will happen, such that if you were one of these aggressors, be that the Russians or the Chinese or others, you would wonder as to what changed on our side of the equation to make it such that now I have to face all of them, not just one of them, right? That's the big difference here.
Wonderful. Well, I think it's fair to say, Chris, that for anybody who has listened to this program over the past hour, that all of us feel blessed by having had you be a member of the commission and bringing your expertise to the table. These are extraordinary times, and clearly we've needed to have the best and the brightest, and we're awfully glad that you are a part of the commission. Awfully glad you were part of this program today. So thank you very, very much.
Jim, thanks very much for the opportunity to have this discussion. Thanks for the support that the Institute gives around the seasons for all of these issues, not least of which this one.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.